Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Disney California Adventure Food and Wine Festival. Please welcome your host, Chef Daniela Malfitano.
Hi everyone! How you doing? Woo! Good to have you here! Hi back there! How you doing? Welcome everyone, I'm Chef Daniela Malfitano, your festival host, and we are so thrilled you're here. Officially welcome to the 2018 Disney California Adventure Food and Wine Festival! Yes! I love the enthusiasm, thank you. I can feel that. All right, before we get started, I want to share a little bit about what's going on out there in Festival Land, okay? We have over a dozen festival marketplaces, and they're all featuring just delicious, fresh California grown flavor. So you have to check out each and every one of them. They are really, really great. My favorite is Nuts About Cheese. That's over by the backlot stage. So do check it out. And it's also exciting to see top chefs in action right here on this stage, so don't miss out. And there are still seats available for the Celebrity Chef live demo with Chef Robert Irvine on March 30th. And there are still seats available for that very fabulous winemaker dinner where you can sample and savor delicious wine from all over the state of California. So for more information on any of our signature events, you can go to disneyland.com/foodandwine to purchase tickets. And for more information about the festival, check out our festival guide or our info boards throughout the venue. Okay guys, are you ready to meet our visiting presenter? Yes, she is amazing. Marcy Smothers says, she's just an ordinary person with extraordinary curiosity. Yet that simple truth has turned her into a noted personality in the Northern California world of food and wine. In 2004, she enjoyed her first time on radio with Sonoma County's news talk station. By 2006, she was a frequent guest host on Bay Area radio stations, and by 2007, she was a frequent guest host and joined forces with Chef Guy Fieri to create the national radio show Food, Guy and Marcy. She's also authored 2 books, and her passion for all things Disney, especially Disneyland, was the inspiration for her labor of love called Eat Like Walt. So without further ado, please put your hands together for Marcy Smothers. To have you back.
Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. Hello, everybody. How exciting to be at Disneyland California Adventure. Disneyland, see, that's my book. Disney California Adventure.
Close enough. Marcy's been with us for a couple of years at our Food and Wine Festival, and this lady is the biggest fan of Disneyland and Walt Disney himself that I've personally ever met. So we have a very special treat for you right in store for this hour. You're going to teach us something that's one of Walt's favorite recipes and one of Disneyland's favorite recipes. So what are you going to be preparing?
Today we're going to be making recipes from the Tahitian Terrace. First of all, raise your hand if you're a fellow Disneyland geek like me and Walt Disney geek. Yeah, I figured you were. Thank you. We are kindred souls. Always good to be with you people. We have to protect Walt's legacy always and keep him alive,
Absolutely.
Which is my goal in my book, which we'll get to. But what we're making is a recipe from the Tahitian Terrace. Does anybody remember that? It's where Aladdin's Oasis is now, and where the new Tropical Hideaway, which was just announced, will be coming. And the Tahitian Terrace was Walt's vision of a dinner show. They had firewalkers, they had women dancers. It was really pretty spectacular. And that opened in 1962. So the recipe is the Tahitian Terrace's Polynesian Pineapple Ribs. The recipe is also on my website, eatlikewalt.com, so you don't have to take any notes. It's all right there. You can make it at home. Super easy. And I guess we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yes, we will, because there's so much to say about the recipe. It's super simple and super delicious. But before that, we have a million stories to talk about with Marcy and her love of Disneyland. And so I want to know, how did your love for Disneyland first begin?
Going to Disneyland once a year, as a child with my grandparents. One special treat was all that we could afford, all we got. My grandfather, who never graduated from high school, read 3 or 4 books a week, and he would lay out a blanket on Main Street USA and read for hours so that we could see the Main Street Electrical Parade and have the best views. And then so as I got older and then I had my own kids, I kept coming back more and more and more. And I knew that I wanted to write a book, since I'm in the food space, about Disneyland's food. But my agent said to me, well, you're going to have to come up with something really unique, because people are writing and blogging about Disneyland's food every day. So what are you going to do? And that was a really good question. I thought a long time about what it would be. And then I started wondering, what was Walt's plan for the food when he opened Disneyland? I had this idea that maybe he had planned on theming it based on some of the things that we would see even in the 50s that were definitely food that was themed to each land. So as I was exploring this idea of Disneyland's culinary history, I found a website called Scribe, and essentially you upload things to it, mostly bad poetry, but I found an insert for the Independent Press Telegram that looked like content, but it was, if you look at the bottom line, it says Walt Disney Productions, and it was inside the local newspapers here in Orange County, and in it Walt said, "Welcome to the kingdom of good eating, where the food is as fabulous as the fun. Like Adventureland and Fantasyland, the food at Disneyland is an attraction unto itself." And every time I say that, I still get goosebumps. So I knew then that I had a book, and I started writing the proposal based on just the culinary history of Disneyland. I had some great people help me. Tom Fitzgerald, who's one of the top Imagineers, Kathy Magnum, who is the Imagineer in charge of all Walt Disney World, and I had them vet to make sure that what I was saying was accurate, because there's frankly a lot of untruths, urban legends, and accuracy out there. And once I sold the book to Disney and I got access to the archives, which, let me tell you, fellow geeks, it is as good as it sounds. Better. You say, I would like to see all the menus, in my case, or memos, and then they bring you Christmas present after Christmas present, box after box after box on these big tables. Has anyone been to the Walt Disney Studios and taken a tour of the archives?
Couple people.
Yeah.
Good.
So it's not that difficult if you can get on the line. It's open to the public. So I highly encourage you to figure it. And D23 has some really special, oh, by the way, who's D23 members? Yep. So I'm a day one D23 member to qualify my geekiness, and a founding member of the Walt Disney Family Museum. So, but yeah, so within the archives, it's just wonderful, and you're touching things occasionally that Walt touched, and seeing these things from his era when Walt was alive. So that got me knowing that there was more to the book than I had planned, that there was really needed to be a chapter about the studio, because Walt was only 39 years old when his Burbank studio opened in 1940, and he never planned to be a restaurateur, but he became one with 4 state-of-the-art restaurants at his studio. And that's because the 3 previous studios didn't have commissaries. One had a little thing, it was called Mary Flanagan's, an enterprising secretary, sort of sold cigarettes and sandwiches, and apparently aspirin for the men that were overserved the night before, and men, mostly men. And so, so he had now this whole other chapter about planning the food, which Walt was very involved with at his studio. And then I did get very lucky and met some family members. So Walt's family cooperated fully with this book, and I spoke to him many times, and we'll get to that, how I know some of these things that have never been published before, they shared with me, and also some images from the Walt Disney Family Museum that they've also never allowed to be published before. And the favorite really being the thing that when I saw this also reaffirmed, Daniela, I had a book, is there's a list that Walt wrote on his for his housekeeper and cook. Her name was Thelma Howard. Her nickname was Foo-Foo because Christopher, Walt and Lillian's first grandson, couldn't say Thelma. It came up with Foo-Foo. Well, Walt referred to Foo-Foo as his Mary Poppins. And she did everything. She cooked, she cleaned from scratch. Really? She took care of all of the grandkids. And he made a list of the food that he liked to eat. And so it's his signature loopy, Walt Disney has very simple foods that he liked to eat, spam and eggs, roasted meats, hamburgers, and only one vegetable is on the list. So when I saw that at the Walt Disney Family Museum, I thought this will tell you more about Walt Disney through the lens of food than a lot of these other stories, because he was a complex, brilliant man, but had very simple tastes. And despite being one of the most famous men on the planet, he wasn't a fancy guy. He didn't care for fancy stuff. No, he didn't. So that's how the book evolved. So now Eat Like Walt is the chapter at home, all about Walt's life at home, relationship to food, the studio, and then land by land at Disneyland. what Walt had intended and what was planned in his era. It's a time capsule of his life. And the other thing that I think makes Eat Like Walt unique is that everybody in the book, no exceptions, knew Walt. Everybody did. So no, my grandfather's stories or my mom told me they knew Walt. And if they weren't somebody that I could talk to alive, then it was interviews I would have read about them in the archives, including my favorite from Herb Ryman. Does anybody know who Herb Ryman is? Herbie? Herb was one of Walt's favorite designers and artists, and he was the one, Herb Ryman, that picked up the phone on one Saturday in 1954, and Walt said, "Hey Herbie, can you come on down to the studio?" So when Walt calls on a Saturday, you go.
Oh, that's right.
You go. And Walt said, "Okay, Herbie, Roy is going to New York on Monday to meet with the bankers, and I need a map of Disneyland for Roy to take on Monday morning." And Herb's looking at his watch. He's like, "That's not even 48 hours. And Walt said, "I'll stay with you. I'll sit right by you. I'll bring sandwiches and coffees in." And that is how the concept map of Disneyland was drawn. And you can find that easily, copies of it, by looking at D23 or various sources. But so Herb was very close to Walt, and also kind of self-deprecating. He also said, "Hey, I was just the guy that picked up the phone that Saturday," right? He's like, because whoever Walt answered the phone was going to come. So this quote is what guided me. I felt this way when I was writing the book because I wanted to present Walt as the everyday Walt. And this is what Herb said to another writer. "It's for people like yourself to have the privilege and the duty of presenting Walt as a human being, a person that can be known and a person you can be close to." And so that to me was one of the most beautiful things, and it's what I strive very hard to do in the book, is to let people see Walt as that human being, not deify him, just the regular guy that he would be, sitting right there where Steve is and like, like, yay, let's eat.
And how did you check the accuracy of all the information that you were collecting or the stories that you were really hearing from other people? I understand that you can get it from the archives, and hopefully that's all accurate, and we know that it is. But in the conversations that you're having with beyond just his family members, his employees, and the people that assisted him, how do you know that they are retelling that information correctly?
That is a very good question. Well, Marty Sklar, if most of you probably know who Marty was an amazing. Was head of Imagineering, and then he was the Imagineering ambassador. So he was one of my sources, as was Jim Cora. Also has a window on Main Street, USA. Jim retired as the chairman of Disney International, and he calls himself my intern. And a lot of these good stories I got from Walt, I'll share, came from Jim Cora. But directly to answer your question, Daniela, it was like defending a dissertation. 1, 2, 3, 4 archivists vetted my book. So 3 in the archives, plus archivist emeritus Dave Smith was hired to do it. So I had a lot of eyes on the book. And if they said, we're not sure, then I'll say I believe or I think or widely thought. I can't say. There's some good stories like that I think are 99% true. Yeah. So that's why I have to qualify it by that. So it was a process, but it only made the book better.
And was there anything that you actually found in that process when the archivists were looking through it that you discovered was inaccurate, and actually the actual information was more interesting or juicy than the bit that you had before?
It's interesting. Well, probably the Club 33 stories are the ones that are the most misunderstood by the public. So would you like me to tell you what I understand? Okay, yeah. So what I know is that it was not based on the original lessees that opened Disneyland. In 1955, when Disneyland opened, Walt had run out of money. He didn't have the staff to run what he called the feeding operations. So every single restaurant was a lessee. They came in, they paid Walt rent. By the way, Walt asked for the first year and the 5th year in advance. Very clever. Very, very clever. And so by 1965, he had bought back most of his restaurants. But it's not true at the time of the opening. There was way more than 33 lessees. It's not true that it's because, which is a good theory, because the only places there are addresses in Disneyland are 2 places: Main Street, USA, and New Orleans Square. So sometimes you might hear, well, you have to have an address for a liquor license, which is true, but that's not the reason. It's also, there's some stories that people found the door and it just had the number. Walt, by the way, really liked numbers a lot. And he did go to the 21 Club in New York and really enjoy that. And in the actual articles of incorporation for Club 33, it is called the 33 Club, like the 21 Club. So I know from his family, Walt really liked numbers. I also know that he really liked to go to 21. What is true that I learned from my intern, because he was there, Jim Cora, is Retlaw. Does everyone know what Retlaw is?
No.
Okay, so Retlaw is Walter spelled backwards. Mm-hmm. And Retlaw is the company that Walt owned for everything in his personal holdings at Disneyland, his trains, the monorail, and Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, although he sold the Tiki Room back to Disneyland on the day that it opened. So Retlaw was for the things that Walt owns himself. The Retlaw employees were told, Jim Cora told me, because Jim read the memo, that it was for the 33 lessees at the time New Orleans Square was dedicated. So I went back and I counted, and that's true, there were 33. Well, that's a good theory, but that is not why I think it was called Club 33. I think it's called Club 33 because something that a family member told me. Again, I don't know that this is true, but I think it makes a lot of sense. 1933 is the year that his daughter Diane Disney Miller was born. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's not random. He loved his children. His two daughters were everything. He built Disneyland to be with his daughters and his family. So that ties into the 13 story. And when I tell this story, Daniela, I get mixed reactions. But I'm going to tell it from my heart because I believe it. So I believe that 13 is Walt Disney's favorite number. So much so that when I sold my book to Disney, the contract ended in $13. And the business affairs and my agent would call and say, there's a mistake. I'm like, oh, no mistake. Yep. And so then when I actually got the offer for the book, I'm not kidding, it came in on September 13th. So as I'm starting to do research, and of course the Disneyland address is 1313 Harbor Boulevard. So that's, everybody knows that. But I thought that there was more connection, and this is what I found. So when I look at Walt's Carolwood caboose, his home railroad, that caboose number is 13. Wow. When I found the invitation for Walt and Lillian's 30th wedding anniversary, it was called Tempest Fugit for Time Flies. They actually had it a few days before Disneyland opened. It was on the Mark Twain and the Golden Horseshoe, which, by the way, geeks, we call it the Golden Horseshoe, not the Golden Horseshoe. And real mint juleps were served with alcohol for their 30th anniversary. But, what day were they married? July 13th. Now you add how fiercely patriotic Walt was in the original 13 colonies. I'm having lunch with two granddaughters and Ron Miller, Walt's son-in-law, and I'm telling him this 13th thing, and Jenny looks at me and she says, Grandpa loved numbers, but no one's put that out there before. And she says, I'm like, what? She goes, Granny's license plate was LBD13. Lillian Bounds Disney 13. People, am I onto something? And so why do I think that 13 was Walt's favorite number? Well, I wanted to call and confirm that 1313 was hand-picked. And a lot of people believe that it was. You can pick addresses, So I called the city of Anaheim and the county of Orange, and everyone said, well, Beth told Ethel, told Vera, told Bob, but no one ever kept records back then, but we all believe that somebody, we don't know if it was Walt or a signee of the park, chose 1313. And the reason is, I believe, as I have to say in the book, because M is the 13th letter in the alphabet, and 1313 is for Mickey Mouse. And 13 was always his favorite number. So, when I turn in my book, I had, go back one more story. So when I had the Club 33 story, I always kind of wondered, why Walt didn't call it Club 13, and that kind of makes sense because a lot of people might be adverse to that number, right? It is unlucky for a lot of cultures and a lot of people, not me, but a lot. So I weave the story of Club 33, and that's followed by my 13 theory. I turned in 50,000 words to Disney, and I've selected every image, 90% of which has never been published before. And when the book came out, and I had the layout, the story of 13 and 33 is on page 133.
Whoa.
Okay, I couldn't have done that if I tried. So, I would say that I have a lot of validations that was Walt's lucky number, and it is the address, and M is the 13th letter of the alphabet, so boom, that's that.
That's amazing. That's an incredible amount of research that you did to actually connect the dots so many times. So amazing.
Well, sometimes when you're doing research, you're led.
Yes.
One thing takes you here, one door closes, another opens. So.
Incredible. Okay, so should we get started on
Okay,
these
so
ribs?
let's get started on the ribs, and I'm going to have some fun facts
Yes.
about the Tahitian Terrace for you. Again, this recipe, every recipe in the book is authentic to Walt's era.
Yes.
The book actually ends in 1967. Walt died December 15th, 1966, but that's because the 3 restaurants that Walt championed didn't open until after he passed away. The Blue Bayou, the Creole Cafe, which, by the way, he had the Creole Cafe because he wanted really good, strong coffee in New Orleans Square. And then there was, of course, Club 33. The Blue Bayou restaurant was ready when Walt dedicated New Orleans Square in 1966. But he said, nope, no, we're not going to have anybody in there that gets not a good show without the boats floating by, so he refused to open it. Otherwise, he would have at least had a chance to eat in one of his 3 restaurants. So all the recipes are either from Walt's home, from the studio, or from Disneyland, authentic. And so, yes, there's going to be MSG in some of them. There is going to be a lot of canned goods, but that was what the era was all about. So,
Who came to Marcy's demo last year where she baked Walt's favorite cookie?
oh yes, thank you. Yeah.
Couple people.
Well, if we get back to that, we could tell that story because that
Yes.
was a completely unknown recipe before well, not completely, vastly unknown.
Marcy knew it, but no one else.
No, other people knew it, but not many. And
Yeah.
you couldn't Google it, but we'll get back. So, Tahitian Terrace ribs. So we're going to start over here with the ribs. How many people know what the silver skin is on ribs?
Couple
Not
people.
many. How many people like to eat them? Okay, so one of the secrets to really great ribs is there's this thin membrane
Yeah.
here, which you can see. I'm not going to
Move it right here.
Thank you. Oh, Mr. Cameraman. Yeah. So it's hard, and I've got a good manicure, so I'm not going to really work at it. But you could see this here.
Yes.
You could use a knife or your fingers. If you pull that off, that makes it a little bit tough because it's a membrane. Or you can ask your butcher to do it. And let's. Recommend you do. Okay. And then you always put. At least I have my first book, Snacks, Adventures in Food, Aisle by Aisle, that's based on the show that I did with Guy Fieri, is that when you put meat directly on a sheet pan, or the weight of the meat presses out some of the juices. So use a rack. It really makes your meat taste better. And if you don't have a rack, make a vegetable rack, which is really cool. Make carrots or onions or lemons or whatever you want, but always try to set your meat on top of something, not directly on a cookie sheet pan or hotel pan. Now, normally I would season my ribs. The reason I don't with the Tahitian Terrace ribs is because there's so much salt in the canned ketchup and the canned soy sauce. There's plenty. So about 275, 2 to 3 hours, you roast your ribs. The original recipe said start with the sauce and baste it all the time. So that's what I put in the book. But personally, I like to roast it 2 hours by itself and just start basting the last hour.
Oh, great. So you can start this in a 200, we have it already prepped out, so we'll put this in the oven
let's
here.
put it in the magic Disney oven.
Yes.
Okay, so then the sauce is a no-cook sauce. The one thing that you should do, and it's not entirely necessary, is to refrigerate it. That's what the recipe calls for overnight. But I realize, like all of you, sometimes we get home and we say, there's no time, I want Tahitian Terrace ribs tonight, so boom. The good news is you're going to have a lot of extra sauce, so you will be able to freeze some of it, which is what I do.
Yes.
All right.
And I love this recipe because it really doesn't require anything that you probably don't already have in your cupboard. So basic ingredients, ketchup.
Very basic.
So basic. If you have kids, you definitely have that, right?
So 2 cups ketchup, very simple. It's so simple.
So simple.
A 1/4 cup of soy sauce, plenty of salt in there. A 1/4 cup of pineapple juice, presaging the Dole sponsorship, which, by the way, Dole Whips did not exist in Walt's era. That didn't happen until the late 70s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What a shame.
I know. I see, that's one of those things that we always talk about. People that love Walt, What do you think Walt's favorite ride would be? What do you think Walt would want to
Right.
eat? You know, I would think the Dole Whips would be
Absolutely.
something that he would love. Then some crushed pineapple, a quarter cup.
Just right from the can.
Right from the can. You could
Great.
use fresh.
Okay.
But I like the texture of the can.
I do too.
A quarter cup of fresh orange juice. No one's going to give you bad points if you used not fresh. Then we have a half cup of brown sugar, a tablespoon of white wine vinegar, and 3 cloves. That is it to make Tahitian Terrace ribs.
Wow.
It's also very, very, very delicious, I think. And again, I'll remind you, the recipe is posted on eatlikewalt.com, so you could go home and make these tomorrow. After you mix it pretty well, you put it in the refrigerator. I forgot, and a half teaspoon of orange zest, which I would normally measure, but you guys get the. And this is really adds so much, don't you think, Danielle?
I really do. And I want to ask Marcy, you don't really change up these recipes at all. You're making these exactly how they're written, right? You're not going to add lime juice instead of orange. You're not going to add cinnamon instead of clove. You're going to try to stick to the traditional recipe.
It was 100% traditional. I had a recipe tester I worked with.
Oh,
and,
wow.
And in the book, I'll say, if you want to be a purist,
Yes.
you got to use the food coloring. I don't care if you do or you don't, but when I say these are authentic to Walt's era, they are. There's 3 recipes that I had to do myself. One's a funny one if we have time, the tea cake recipe from the studio. Does anybody remember Casa de Fritos?
Who remembers that? Couple
Yeah.
people.
That was in Frontierland.
Yes.
And the gentleman who found the patent, Mr. Doolin, for Fritos, he found those in Mexico, this extruded chip. That's how the Frito company happened. So he opened the Casa de Fritos in Frontierland next to where the River Bell is today. And they were so popular so quickly. By the way, it said Mexican food on one side and Spanish food on the other side. So a little unclear because tacos were popular then. And within less than a year, they were so popular that they moved across to where Rancho del Zocalo is now. So there's the tacup, which was the signature dish at Casa de Fritos. Mr. Doolin also invented the patent for the tortilla bowl, the fried tortilla bowl. So he had this fried tortilla bowl with meat and cheese like we would know it, but there was no photographs, there's no pictures, so I had to also recreate that. But it's based lovingly on every image that I could see from, what few there are of what a tacup is. But all the other ones, yes. Oh yeah, the third one is Indian. So Oscar, does everyone know Oscar?
No.
Okay, so Oscar was the longest employee of Disneyland. He started out in Fantasyland, but he ended up at Carnation Cafe where he spent most of his time. He just retired last year after 56 years. He started in 1956. His wife, Shirley, had the honor of making Walt's milkshakes. And how did Walt like his milkshakes? He liked them with vanilla and chocolate ice cream, with chocolate sauce added and a little bit runny. And he always paid for them. I don't know if you guys know that, but any time in the park, Walt always paid. And on my Eat Like Walt website, I have the Disneyland After Dark episode with Walt because he's holding popcorn, he's eating popcorn. And once again, he goes, here you go. He's paying the guy on TV. So, yes. So the recipes have all been tested. They're all authentic, and some of them are better tasting than others.
That just goes to show you who Walt Disney really is. That he's going to pay for his own food.
Always
at the park,
insisted.
And he's always going to be so hospitable to the people that are serving him.
One of my favorite stories is the Sunkissed Citrus House, which is next to the where the Penny Arcade is now, right next door. Walt used to break in to the Citrus House because he loved the extractors. You'd get the orange, go, and he just thought that was so fun before the park opened. What did he do? He left money on the counter every time he broke in. But see, he didn't own the Citrus House. Sunkissed it. So technically he was breaking in. Well, Beau Foster, who was the Sunkissed manager, said, well, let's just put an extractor up in Walt's apartment in Disneyland and we'll supply the fresh fruit anytime he's in town, in the park. And so they did that, but that wasn't fun. The breaking in was fun. And I don't know that I don't know if he did or he didn't, but he still broke in even after the Citrus House had their installed those for Walt.
I love that.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stories. And one of the fun things about looking at the images of any time you're looking at Disneyland is that you can tell whether it was a stage photo with Walt or if they captured Walt candidly in the park very simply. Look for guests. It seems so obvious, but I learned that from the archives. You'll see Walt standing, there's no one around, versus he's actually in the park with people. Very interesting distinction. Now you have one of the great fun facts and looking at some of the photographs, the vintage photographs of Walt. So back to our sauce. It's been in the refrigerator for 24 hours. Your ribs are been roasting for 2. The one thing you have to do there are 3 cloves in there. The recipe in the book says strain the sauce, but I actually don't like to strain it because I like the bits of pineapple. It makes it delicious and caramelized. So you kind of, if you're up for it, like Danielle's doing, have a clove hunt, pull those out, and then you're ready to go and start basting your ribs. So what happened with the Tahitian Terrace, back to the story and Walt building it, he knew he wanted a great dinner dance show. At the time, he was going to have Stouffer's Restaurants was going to run the Tahitian Terrace. Now, Stouffer's wasn't just frozen foods. Vern Stouffer had a series of very successful restaurants. So Walt took Joe Fowler. Does anybody know who Joe is? Yeah, so Admiral Joe Fowler went to work with Walt. He was his head of construction. Fowler's Harbor, if you've been on the rivers of America or if you're taking a tour on the Mark Twain riverboat, you'll see that's for Joe Fowler. So he takes Joe Fowler to the spot where Aladdin's Oasis now is, and he's building what was then called the Disney Dendron. It was a man-made tree, and it was the second highest tree in Disneyland in Walt's era, the highest being the Swiss Family Robinson treehouse, the third highest being the tree on Tom Sawyer's Island, and the fourth highest being the tree in the Blue Bayou. So when they were looking at this tree, Walt was concerned that the tree branches were too low because you wouldn't be able to see the dancers. So he told Walt told Joe to grow the tree. And Walt said, I can't grow the tree, it's a tree, And Walt said, Joe, cut it, add 3 feet, make it taller. And even Joe was like verklempt at that moment. He also said to Joe, I want to have this curtain of water, and then the curtain of water is going to part, and then the dancers are going to come through, and then the curtain of water is going to come together. And Fowler's shaking his head, but he had this attitude. Joe always said, can do, and he figured out how to make that curtain of water for Walt. So that's pretty cool. I'm excited about Tropical Hideaway. I think it's going to be, as how I interpret the way it looks when they released it, all the images, a combination of the Tahitian Terrace and a whole bunch of other tiki concepts, which we could get into the whole story of after we do this. So I keep my ADD going. So now we are, these have been cooking for 2 hours. Now we're going to start basting.
Great, and you just use a brush to do this, right?
I like the silicone brushes because they're super easy to clean.
Yes.
Although I grew up with my grandmother's, paintbrush from Ace Hardware. And I still have it. It's probably so full of contaminants, I can't even think.
That's so funny. I do too. I throw mine in the dishwasher.
I do too.
It's totally fine.
It is totally fine. I just like that old school. Anyway, so we base, and then 3 hours later, let's see what happens with the magic Disney oven.
And if you wanted to, have you ever done this with pineapple on the base? Like instead of the rack, just using pieces of fresh pineapple?
That's a fantastic idea. That also would be a great rack if you don't have a rack. Right. And or both. And I should also say that with the ribs in the original recipe for the Tahitian Terrace, they had individual ribs.
Okay.
Slice the ribs apart, then roast them with the sauce constantly. That just dries out your ribs. So we want to keep it intact, fat its flavor, keep it all together, get the best possible taste. But again, because that's the way the recipe was written for Disneyland, that's how you'll find it in the book. And then I have this whole kind of more from Marcy section at the end of some recipes about how I do it a little bit differently, but not altering the basic recipe.
And how many times will you baste, Marcy?
Oh, over and over for an hour.
Okay, great.
For me, the last hour. Or you can do it Disneyland way and just keep basting. And then here's what you kids are going to get a taste of. Ta-da!
Wow.
Yeah, the Tahitian Terrace Pineapple Polynesian Ribs.
Those look amazing. Okay, I think we should do a little plate because we have, some basic white rice here.
Yeah.
And it's so delicious.
All right.
So I'll help you with that.
Okay. You can do the cutting?
I will.
Okay. So the next kind of fun thing in terms of the Tahitian tiki culture is the story of how Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room was meant to be a restaurant. How many people know that? Well, it was. And there's so many great stories. I'm going to have to give you the cliff notes. But Walt wanted a Chinese restaurant at Disneyland. And it was initially planned for the Liberty Square area, which also wasn't built, behind the parade gates on the east side of Disneyland. So if you're walking into Disneyland on the right side by the hat shop, you would have gone back there. It would have been like a big amphitheater and a Chinese human being, audio animatronic man, was going to tell fortunes and talk to you, and you would have a Chinese meal. Well, pretty soon, Walt went on a trip to the South Seas, and he kind of became enchanted with the tiki culture and decided to make it a tiki restaurant. But here's the many fun facts. I'll get out as many as I can. The first audio, and this is something I discovered. I don't know, it's been put out there, but I found it fascinating because I heard it from Bob Gurr, and then I had it corroborated. The first audio animatronic head was not Mr. Lincoln.
Wow.
No, it was this Confucius character. And actually, iWorks talks about how the head was on a table once and how creepy it was because eyes are moving, just the head. Well, so when Walt had the head built, and by that time, that's all that was built. Then he goes to a trip to the South Seas and decided maybe not Chinese, it's going to be tiki, and then the location got changed to Adventureland where it is today. In my book, I have the picture of the beautiful concept art by John Hench that showed what it would look like if it was a restaurant. And we still have the 4 quadrants, and we still have the bird fountain up there, but you know what's under the bird fountain? That was the busing station. And if you go up like this, it still opens. That's where the plates would go. I keep waiting. They keep telling the story where they have to glue those. I asked yesterday, and I haven't had to glue them yet. So that's one proof or evidence that's still there that Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room was meant to be a restaurant. Another is the restaurant chairs. Who remembers the restaurant chairs before the pews? Well, if you look at the old pictures, they were, I wasn't alive either, but at that point, but I see that they were all restaurant chairs because they had restaurant chairs. They just put them together with steel bars.
Wow.
And they swiveled, so you could see the birds and move like that. I was very curious, when did the restaurant chairs get removed? So I asked the photo archivist, I stared at a million pictures, and nobody knew. Until one day, I was having lunch with an Imagineer named Kyle Barnes that does Trader Sam's. He's sort of the tiki expert for Walt Disney Imagineering. He goes, that would be me. I took them out in 2002. So not until 2002 were the restaurant chairs taken out. And then the third proof, if you will, that Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room was meant to be a restaurant are the secret restrooms. Because California sit-down restrooms California sit-down restaurants must have restrooms. So that's why in the Garden of the Gods, that little restroom that's there was because when it was designed to be a restaurant. So there was a mock-up of the restaurant on the stage in the studios in Burbank. And pretty soon they're watching the show and they just determined there's no way they could turn it over every hour as they had planned, that people would want to linger and see the birds, and the restaurant idea was abandoned, and it became the attraction that we know and love today. But think about this. The idea was, before we all became so used to this attraction, that you would walk into this room and all the birds would be, and flowers would be inanimate. And you would think, well, what's the show going to be? Can you imagine the surprise when they started singing? It had to be tremendous. It still is one of my favorite attractions. And I always like to deputize my fellow geeks. Please do refer to it as Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, at least the first time of the day that you say it. It has his name on it. He owned it. And I think it's really important that we keep Walt's name in every single thing he touched in Disneyland that is still around today. I feel very strongly about that. So circling back to the head, Bob Gurr told me another story about the Chinese head. It was either one of two things, that Walt wanted a Chinese restaurant, which is widely believed, and so he ordered the Confucius head to be built. Bob Gurr says that is not the way it happened. And he said the way it happened was that there was a gentleman in the shop named Jack Gladish. And Jack, on his own volition, was tinkering with this idea of a human head. But it was not a project for Walt. It's just like, would this be cool? And there's so many stories of Walt. He walked in and then what was planned changed. Walt walks in and he sees the head moving in the eyes. And he said to Jack, that is so cool. Okay, now that's your project, finish it. And so at the time, the latex and all the different types of ways of making skin were new. And so when they made the head, it seemed to some people, he started to appear to be Chinese. And some people think that Walt saw that Chinese head, or what appeared to be Asian to Walt, that gave him the idea for the Chinese restaurant in the first place. So, kind of your question earlier, Daniela, in that case, even with 4 archivists vetting the book, I did put both stories in because we really don't know, Walt's not here, which one is true, so both stories are there for that purpose. So.
Wow.
Okay, so now you slice my ribs. Okay, now
I slice them. I have to ask you, how were they served when they were served? Were they served with the white rice?
Well, see, these are the things that I don't know.
Okay.
So that when the festival said to me, what should the side dish be? I'm like, well, the rice is always good. You know, rice tastes great with ribs. There's a chow yuk recipe in the book, which is a very traditional dish. It's a chicken protein and vegetables. There's several Tahitian Terrace recipes, the mahi-mahi. I do know from reading what the menu would have been in Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki, and then it was called Tiki and Bird Room, by the way. That was the first name for the project for a long time, actually. If it had been a restaurant, I know the food that would have been served, and one of them would have been fried rice. So I think that this would be excellent with fried rice as well.
This looks perfect the way that it is. I love it with plain rice. Pretty nice, right, guys? You can do that at home, and I hope that you will, because you can eat like Walt. Yummy!
You got to eat like Walt.
You got to eat like Walt.
So let's see, how are we doing on time? Okay, questions.
Yeah.
Anytime you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. Stephen, you have a question. He's my plant.
We have a mic coming to you.
Oh, good. Now he has to come up with a question. I know Stephen from a lot of things, but who has been to Walt's Barn in Griffith Park?
Yes.
Okay, so Walt's Barn is a very, very special place for us Walt people. When Walt's Homely Hills home sold, where he had his home railroad, Diane saved the red barn that was in the backyard. This barn is where Walt would tinker, where he built his miniatures that he loved to do, where he switched his train. They consider it the birthplace of Imagineering. So the house sold, but Diane bought the barn, and she entrusted it to the Carolwood Foundation, and it was installed at Griffith Park. And it has a lot of memorabilia in it. It is Walt's barn, guys, and his combine train is there, as well as Ollie North's train station. Because the two animators, 9 old men, that got Walt to love trains were Ward Kimball, his barn just unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, and Ollie's. So Ollie's is the last barn of the 9 old men that is there and that is around, and that is also at Walt's Barn. So it's open on the 3rd Sunday of every month, and I'll be back on July 15th for the Disneyland anniversary coming up on the 17th, and Eat Like Walt Day. So if you live in the area, come see us. Well, and it's also Charles Phoenix is there March 18th. He was a wonderful Disney historian. Yes, sir. What's your question, please?
Are you going to be involved with the new tiki, what they're going to do with Aladdin's Oasis?
Oh, the Tropical Hideaway? No, I'm not the boss of Disneyland yet. No. I mean, I got a lot of great ideas. I would love to be, a part of it. But I think that concept art looks great, and I really do. I know the I've spoken at Imagineering twice. I'm going back to speak to Imagineers next week, so you never know. But I know they're heavily into diving into what was historical and try to bring some of that back.
Well, they have a new president now, so have you met him yet?
No, I haven't met Mr.
Not yet.
Weiss. No, I hope to.
Yes, absolutely.
I hope to.
Marcy, what was your favorite, thing that you got to explore in writing Eat Like Walt? What was your favorite part of writing that book?
I would say definitely the family chapter,
Yeah.
Walt at home, hearing so many great stories. Which one of them, by the way, Thelma, Fufu Howard, his Mary Poppins. Walt gave Thelma stock for every birthday and every Christmas. And she held on to it because she thought that selling stock was being disloyal to her boss. When Thelma Pearl Howard died, she was worth $9 million. The only thing she'd ever spent any money on was buying a house for her son, a modest house for herself, and a place for her son. So the Thelma story gets even better. She was family to the Disney family. So Diane was used to exchanging Christmas cards with Fufu. And one Christmas, Diane realizes that she's not getting any cards. And she grew concerned. So she looked for her and found her in a shabby nursing home, sharing a ward with men and women. Diane moved her to the motion picture home with a beautiful view of the gardens, where she stayed for the rest of her life. Diane sent her flowers every Monday and visited her all the time. And that's who Fufu was to the family. So telling those stories was really important to me, and nothing that I had expected when I started. The Chinese candy cookie story figures into that as well. I had found, I'm not the only Disney historian that knows this book. It's called 5-Star Favorites. It's hard to find now. But there's the recipe there for Chris's cold pie, which, do you guys know that? Have you heard of that? You could find that in the Disney park books. It's a cold pie named for Christopher's, Walt and Lillian's first grandson. But you would have had to know in looking in this book that Lillian remarried after Walt passed away, a gentleman named Mr. John Truyans. And Mrs. John Truyans had a recipe for Chinese candy cookies, which was kind of popular back in the day. It's chow mein noodles, butterscotch chips, and peanuts. And so when I saw this, I started Googling butterscotch Walt, haystack, Chinese. You couldn't find it because no one knew about it. So when I interviewed Walt's two granddaughters and Ron Miller for the first time, I made the Chinese candy cookies. And when I set them out, Jenny said, oh, she started crying, and she said, you made my grandma's cookies, And she said Fufu had them in the cookie jar Fufu worked for them long after Walt passed away. She worked for them, for the Disney family, for 30 years, and the cookies were always in the cookie jar wrapped in wax paper. So that recipe is in the book, and that's what we made last time together this time last year.
And people love them. They are so easy to make and so delicious. They just remind me so much of Disneyland and Walt Disney now. Every single time I make them, and I make them a lot because they're so simple, I just feel like I'm a part of the Walt Disney family and the lineage. So really special to get that.
I do too. So
I get tears in my eyes every time you tell that story. It's pretty beautiful.
There's another story with the family that shows my level of geekiness. And but I'm a radio host, so I'm used to asking questions. And I figured this was the most obvious question. So I said to Tam and Jenny and Ron, what did you see when you opened Walt's refrigerator? And they said, no one's ever asked us. I'm like, what? I want to know everything.
Yeah.
Start, And they did. And I was just writing as fast as I could, and I was recording it. So in the book, it lists all the different things that were there. But what really fascinated me was that Fufu always had a relish tray on ice in the refrigerator. Always. There was never not a relish tray. Walt loved crudité. And so I asked them, well, what was on it? They said, well, celery and radishes and turnips and everything. Well, now I'm getting obsessed because if you want to eat like Walt, now clearly you have to have a relish tray. But how was it? Whole radishes, half radishes, carrot coins, celery sticks? I wrote them so many times trying to get exactly how the vegetables were cut that at my D23 presentation with them on the stage, they said that I was a complete nag. Like, stop asking us. But I said, if you're going to eat like Walt.
Well, did you find out?
I did, and it's in the book. It's very specific. But then after I heard that story, I started looking at these food photos, and if you're a geek like me, you're zooming in. Right. Walt had them in a lot of the pictures in the book. You'll see he would have that tray. Marty Sklar told me they always had, before meetings with Walt, there was always this relish tray. So it's a tiny detail like Walt loved, but it's a giant detail. It had never been reported before, and it talks about a tradition that Walt had, which are these crudité, which is my one time that I went to the CIA. I took a lot of classes as an enthusiast. My teacher, Chef D, said, all undercooked vegetables is crudité. It's like, he didn't.
Yes.
Anyway. Lastly, a recipe that I think it's really fun to talk about. Who remembers the Silver Banjo barbecue? Okay, these are all, back in the day restaurants, the late 60s in Frontierland. So the Silver Banjo barbecue took over the space that was occupied by Casa de Fritos, right next door to where the River Bell is today. And you can see if you look at the book and you look there, it looks identical. So there's only one restaurant in the history of Disneyland that's had someone's name on it other than Walt Disney or one of Walt's characters, and that's Don DeFore's Silver Banjo barbecue. Walt met Don. He was an actor. He had a show called Hazel, and then Ozzie and Harriet were his shows. And Walt had this idea. He came up with this thought that the Emmys should be televised. Before, they hadn't been televised. And one of the reasons he wanted to have them televised was so he could win Emmys for his Disneyland show on TV. But, he really wanted to do it. But Don DeFore was the president of the Television Academy at the time and beat Walt to it. And the Emmys were televised under Don's leadership. But Walt was so impressed with Don, he invited him to come to Disneyland when it was under construction. Don DeFore and his sons were opening day guests. And when this spot became vacant, he asked Don if he wanted to run it. Don said, sure, I've always wanted to have a barbecue restaurant. The thing is that Don wasn't a cook. He was an actor. So he didn't have a sauce recipe. So he went to his restaurant, Love's. Does anyone remember Love's from the San Fernando Valley? he would go to Love's, he would buy sauce, and he would bring it down to this Disneyland and at Silver Band's Barbecue. Well, the restaurant got popular, and there wasn't enough sauce. Love's couldn't supply him, so what did Don DeFore do? He took the sauce to UCLA's chemist lab, where they broke down the ingredients. So what they can do at these labs is they can get the ingredients, but not the amounts, right? That's something different. So Mrs. DeFore, in her home kitchen, apparently for a week, tried many different batches until they got what they thought was closest to Love's, and that was the sauce that was used at the Silver Banjo Barbecue. Now, this isn't in the book. There's only 3 things that they told me I couldn't use in the book, which is great. And I will want to qualify this. This is just what the DeFore family thinks, But the DeFore family, Don sent it to Hunt's and asked if Hunt's would make the sauce, and they declined. But Don swore, and his sons that are still alive, Ron and Dave, think it tastes very much like Casey Masterpiece's sauce.
Wow.
You be the judge. So
Yeah.
now, fade out, fade in. They, for me, and the talk that they did at Disneyland last year, went back into their kitchen and worked to recreate the recipe that their mother made. And they gave the Silver Banjo barbecue sauce recipe to me exclusively for Eat Like Walt. So I'm very, very grateful for that. Yeah.
So cool.
You can definitely eat like Walt. And so you have 2 barbecue sauce recipes, very different. One from the Tahitian Terrace and one from a Frontierland restaurant back in the day.
And are all of your recipes on eatlikewalt.com or only some of them?
Only a few.
Okay.
So the Tahitian Terrace ribs there now. The other one is the tea cake recipe,
Yes.
which will be my closer story. Second closer story. But the tea cake recipe is in Walt's studio. We had 4 restaurants, right? Well, one of them was called the Penthouse, and that was for men only. It was mostly the higher ranking animators. They had a restaurant, they had a bar, they had a place for a gym, a place for massages. But Walt, by the way, I learned this from a fellow historian, Mindy Johnson. Per capita, Walt had a higher percentage of women in his workforce than the rest of America at the time. Yeah, he did. Yes, he did, and that's quantified. And so he had a special place for the inkers and the painters. They had an inking and painting building. And the inkers and the painters, briefly, so the inkers would trace what the animators had done, and the painters would flip the cell, and they would paint it in. And that work was done exclusively by women. So there was a tea lounge in their building where they could have sandwiches and tea, and these tea cakes for tea time. The reason they had tea time and not coffee time is because the caffeine in the coffee would make their hands shake. And so the women didn't ever have caffeine. They were very, very careful because this was very deft work. Anyway, the tea cakes were supplied by Martino's Bakery in Burbank. It's been there since 1926, a top secret recipe.
Can you still get the tea cakes there?
Oh yes, you can still get the tea cakes if you go to Burbank Martino's. They're wonderful. So I went in there, feeling really chipper. Hi, I'm Marcy. I'm writing a blah, blah, blah. Would you share your super secret tea cake recipe? Well, you can imagine the response. No. These are new owners, but no. So I did some culinary CSI, and I would go into Martino's and say, I'm allergic to almonds. Is there any almonds in this? So I started eliminating things because I would taste it with my friend who's a baker. We taste almond. We thought we tasted lemon. So I told him I was allergic to lemon juice. They said, no worries. I'm like, there's no lemon juice. I looked in the garbage. I'm not kidding. So 40 tries to get the tea cake recipe, and I thought it was really important. And I didn't want to make it exactly the same. I want to honor the super secret tea cake recipe. But the whole thing about eating like Walt, you can't eat these baked, unless you live in Los Angeles area. So now if you live anywhere in the world, you can make the tea cakes. And the other recipe I'm proud of it's not a Disneyland recipe, it's a home recipe that I had to recreate, are Fufu's green beans. So Walt's favorite dish, one vegetable, at home was the green beans that Fufu made. And they had bacon and red onion and herbs in them. And so I sat with Tam, who cooked with Fufu all the time. Tam was very close to Fufu. And we recreated, with the help of the family, the way that Walt's favorite green beans recipe. So that's Fufu's green beans. So.
Yum.
We're 5 minutes. Any questions?
Okay.
Good. No.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have one more question.
Yes.
What is Walt's favorite food? I already know the answer, but I think you might have changed it over the last year since I've seen you last.
Everyone wants to say chili.
Yes.
And I don't know, what his favorite food was. I know it was a very favorite food. And that at the studio, he used to eat his chili with saltines, and he would put saltines in his coat pockets. And Lillian used to go crazy because he had really nice suits, but when she would take them to the dry cleaner, she'd have to do this because of the, the salty crackers. So I have the recipe that you've seen before. They're all in Pam Brandon's fabulous books that give you park recipes, the official one. But I also found one in the archives, and then I found a second source in a cookbook called Kings in the Kitchen. Interesting. Where that recipe has suet, which is the fat that's around the kidneys. It has a lot more spice. It's different, quite different. Walt really didn't care for spice, so my theory is, and both recipes are in the book, that the spicy version was the one, at some point, was the one that Walt was working for, but that they made it more to his palate, a very simple palate. So yes, for sure chili, but I think hot dogs will be right up there.
Yeah.
And hamburgers. That's the other thing I asked his family, what was on Walt's hamburgers? They're like rolling their eyes.
Does anyone know what was on Walt's hamburgers?
Well, you can tell because in the book there's an image of him eating
Is a picture.
hamburgers at home. So I'd zoom in. So we know mayonnaise and ketchup and lettuce and tomato and pickles and cheese. But the exact, I've tried. If anyone finds out, please write to me at eatlikewalt.com. But the one funny story that Bob Gert told me, again, just explains how Walt operated. He flew his team on his jet to have a meeting with Westinghouse to be a sponsor for Walt Disney World. And they served lobster salad in the executive lunchroom. Very elegant man coming, one of the most famous men on the planet. Let's have a fancy lunch. Well, as soon as Walt left that meeting, he turned to Bob Gurr and he said, well, that was an awful lunch. Let's go get some cheeseburgers and some milkshakes. So.
You know it all. You're the best, Marcy.
Thank you so much.
Let's
You're
give it
welcome.
up for Miss
Thank you,
Marcy
guys.
Smothers. It is
you
so
very much.
great to have you on stage. Thank you.
You're
If
welcome.
people want more information about her book, again, it's Eat Like Walt and eatlikewalt.com. You can write to Marcy. She loves to answer all things Disney, so please reach out. You guys, we are here until April 12th. We hope that you come back for more events. Next up is Mr. Sean O'Neill at 6 p.m. right here on this stage. He is certainly a top chef, so please come back for that. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Eat like Walt.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you for joining us for this special presentation. Please enjoy the rest of your day at Disney California Adventure Food and Wine Festival.